All right. Hello, seventh graders. This today is March 20th. I'm recording this video. This is going to be obviously the new way to reach you guys or to get you some instruction since we're on shutdown for this COVID-19 business. We're going to jump back a little bit. As you can see, let me move myself over here. As you can see, we're going back to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is about plants, and I think I'd mentioned before that we were going to try and do something with someone from the state park system, and they were going to come out and we were going to do a little field trip one day, but obviously that's not going to probably happen. So I decided we might as well get our plant chapters done. There's 2 chapters on plants, and then from there we'll get into the human body system stuff. But for now, hey, let's talk about plants. We're in chapter 9. All right. The first section, 9.1, is about the overview of plants, kind of like the basic anatomy of a plant, their structures, kind of what they're like, and how they function. So 9.1 is overview of plants. Now, when we think about describing some of the characteristics of plants, we think about, if you were to make some observations about plants, what's a plant like? What would be a word that you would describe or use to describe plants? What does it look like? What do they smell like? What do they feel like? Now, obviously, there's a lot of differences in plants, and some plants are soft, and some plants have thorns, and some plants have seeds, and some plants don't, and some plants have spores, and some create fruit. Some are green, some are blue, some are tall, some are short. Lots and lots of different ways that we can describe plants, but some stuff is the same for all plants, like how they get energy, how they absorb water through their roots and process energy, things like that. So there are 2 things that all plants have in common, and they are different than other cells. Now, recall that human cells, animal cells, or other eukaryotic cells are different than plant cells, okay? Plant cells have what we call a cell wall. So if we look at the diagram here, the cell wall is the very outer part, and that's made of cellulose. And that cell wall is there to help give structure and support. Without a cell wall, plants wouldn't be able to stand up, right? Because gravity is always kind of pushing on them and trying to make them fall back down to the earth a little bit. And it's the cellulose or the cell wall that's able to withstand the force of gravity and help plants to grow up tall, right? Because they want to get closer to the sun, because that's where they're creating or they're starting their energy making process. The other thing that plant cells have that animal cells or other eukaryotic cells don't have is chloroplasts. Okay, so chloroplasts, those little green looking things, look like jelly bellies, if you will. We've talked about them before when we initially talked about cells, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically in the next chapter about how they use those chloroplasts and the anatomy and what's going on inside of those chloroplasts. So plants are multicellular organisms, right? We could look at slides of plants and we would see that, and we have before, we would see that there are many, 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 almost countless cells in a plant, okay? Each one of those cells needs to be able to process energy. And because plants get their energy from the sun, they use energy from the sun to help create energy molecules, if you will. But because they get their energy from the sun, they don't consume stuff. So they are not consumers, they are producers. Remember, plants are producers. They get their energy by some outside source. And that outside source just so happens to be the sun. If I'm going too fast for you, feel free to pause the video and slow things down. But I'm just going to kind of cruise through here. Now, we think about how plants first appeared on our planet, and obviously we weren't here, so we didn't get to see it happening. But plants originated in the ocean, and over time, they adapted to changes in their environment to be able to grow in a variety of different environments. And we'll talk about those different environments and how those plants are a little bit different. Some plants need seeds, some plants they don't need seeds, and things like that. Some plants have spores, and we'll get into all that. So one thing that's really tough to look at when we think about looking at the history of plants is that we don't really know a lot about the history of plants because they're a soft-bodied organism. And so fossilization of those organisms is really tough. I mean, we might find fossils, you could find tons of fossils of snails or shelled organisms, shark's teeth, things like that, because those body structures are pretty rigid. And usually it's those rigid body structures like bones and stuff like that that are easy to become fossilized. Plants, not so much. They go through to become fossils, oftentimes they go through what's called carbonization. And basically what it leaves is a carbon imprint of the plant on some sort of sedimentary rock, is usually how that works out. The oldest plant fossil that we know of is about 420 million years old, okay? That's, pretty old. Now, flowering plants are a relatively new thing. And I know on the picture here, or on the slide, it says about 120,000 or 120 million years ago. Now, 120 million years is really not that long ago when we think about the history of the Earth. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old, or 4,600 million, okay? So 120 million years in the grand scheme of things, if we were looking at a timeline, 100 million years, if our timeline is this long, 100 million years or 120 million years is like this much of that, okay? It's a very small amount of time that flowering plants have been on our planet. Now, we know that plants originated in the ocean and they adapted to their changes in environment, and eventually they were able to live on land. And there were some distinct advantages of being on the land. There's more carbon dioxide on the land, right? Carbon dioxide can be in the water. It's absorbed into the ocean, and that happens naturally. And plants can absorb carbon dioxide that way. But there's more carbon dioxide, and access to carbon dioxide is easier. The other thing is the sunlight shines more directly if plants are on the surface of the earth, not down in the water, okay? So more carbon dioxide, more sunlight. Now, when we think about organisms, other organisms on the planet that benefit from plants, what are we thinking about? Realistically, plants are the things that are creating oxygen for organisms, okay? And more specifically for humans, because guess what? We really like to breathe. All right, so plants are important for a lot of different reasons. I would say for humans, aside from we need plants in order for food source, but we also need oxygen, okay? Plants are very well adapted to live on the land. This picture here is a picture of a pitcher plant, and we actually do have those in Minnesota. I've seen them in the forest near Buffalo River State Park. I've seen them in the bogs up by Itasca State Park. But they're here, and they are well adapted. And the reason that pitcher plants even exist is because there's some shortage of nutrients in the ecosystem or in the soil that it doesn't have enough access to. I think it's usually nitrogen. So what happens is little bugs and things like that will fall down into the pitcher plant, and there's digestive enzymes inside the pitcher plant that will help to break down those materials, and the plant then will get the nutrients that it needs. Mr. Hemberger just came in, so I want to pause for a second. All right, so back at it here. Yeah, so plants are very well adapted for the environments that they live in. Obviously, if you go somewhere away from Minnesota, you'll notice that the plants in those areas are probably very different. And that's because as environments are changed, the plants that are in those areas have to change along with the environment, or else they won't be able to survive. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about the stalks of plants and the cells. The cells all are covered by a cell wall. Then that cell wall gives protection and support to the plant. If it wasn't for that rigid cell wall, we think about like if a wind came by or a breeze was blowing, it would blow those plants over. Well, if we have rigid cellulose cell walls, the plants won't blow over and they'll be able to withstand those kinds of forces that are trying to knock it down. Other adaptations that help plants is to conserve water, right? Because plants need to have water, would be things like the cuticle. It's that waxy layer on the outside of the cell. You can see it right here. And that helps to prevent water from evaporating off of the leaves or out of the leaves. Other adaptations, we talked about the cellulose. Those are the fibers that are used to give structure and support for those plants, okay? The cellulose is made up of sugar molecules. Now, not sugar molecules in the sense that we're used to, like if we wanted to put sugar on, like table sugar, it's a different type of a sugar molecule, but it is still called a sugar. Because of the cell walls on all of those plant cells, we end up with things like wood that are able to support a whole lot of weight. So like a lot of buildings, in fact, most residential buildings are made out of wood or lumber. And that lumber, the reason that lumber is rigid and hard is because it's made up of cell walls that have have cellulose that make them really strong and rigid. There's two types of plants. So we think about how we're going to classify these different types of plants. There are vascular plants and non-vascular plants. Now, oftentimes when we think about the word vascular, we think about like the vascular system of a human being or a dog or whatever. That's the veins and arteries that help to carry your blood around inside of a human. Plants have vascular tissue as well. Those are, instead of being like tubes like veins that carry blood for humans, it's tube-like things or structures that carry water and nutrients and other stuff that plants might need throughout the plant, right? Because they're getting their nutrients from the soil or in the ground, and that stuff needs to make its way up out to the leaves. Now, if you think about, some plants are very, very tall, like hundreds of feet tall, like the giant sequoia and redwood trees, okay? In order for that water and nutrients to get all the way to the top of those trees, it needs to have a very complex vascular system, okay? Now, not all plants have a vascular system. Some are non-vascular, okay? They don't have tubes, and they move stuff around inside the cell by alternative means. Okay, sorry, I had to take a phone call for a minute there. So in order for plants to be able to survive on land, their reproductive strategy had to change a little bit. I'm going to back up one slide here. The reproductive strategy had to change a little bit. Now, we probably remember from elementary school, there's, anatomy that helps, that allows that to happen. We'll get into the details of how plants are able to reproduce in a different section. When we think about early scientists or botanists or just people that were studying plants, obviously there's a huge variety of different types of plants, and we sort of have categorized those in different groups, okay? So those different groups are on the left-hand side of your screen. Herbs, okay? Not to be confused with Herbst, but herbs, shrubs, trees, bushes, and flowers. I hope you all laughed a little bit. I know, that was a lame dad joke, right? Okay, so when we think about this, the plant kingdom, right? We think about the different types of plants that there are, and those plants are either going to be vascular plants or non-vascular plants, okay? Now, the vascular plants have to be then subcategorized again, right? So we go here, we have plants, vascular plants, so plants that have tubes for carrying nutrients and things around, and then we have non-vascular plants. We'll get to the details of that in a little bit. Then of the vascular plants, we either have plants that have seeds or plants that don't have seeds, okay? Again, we'll get to seedless plants in a little bit. And then the seed plants are further subcategorized into angiosperms and gymnosperms, okay? And again, we'll get into details of that. But just very generally, angiosperms create flowers. Gymnosperms are like pine trees that have cones and things like that. And then it goes down even further than that. There's monocots and dicots. And again, all the details are coming up. Okay, so that was it for the very first section. There's a pop quiz, obviously, you can see. So let's just run through this real quick. Name 2 parts of plant cells that animal cells don't have. Just think about it for a second. What are they? A cell wall and chloroplast. Those are the 2 things that plant cells have that animal cells don't have. Okay. Next question. Organisms that make their own energy by using an outside source. Remember, producers. Okay. Those are plants. They get their energy from the sun, or they start the process with the sun. And then the last question, you can see now that I have question number 2 and then question number 2 again. The fibers used for plants, used by plants for structure and support, made from sugar molecules. Remember what that's called? Very good, cellulose. All right. Okay, that's it for section 1. Section 2, 9.2 is about seedless plants. Okay, so seedless plants have thread-like structures. You can see those down here. Instead of having roots, they have what are called rhizoids, okay? These little thread-like structures that act like roots are called rhizoids. Mosses are that type. They typically grow in damp areas near the base of tree trunks or on rocks and things of that nature. Oftentimes we think of if you're lost in the woods, you can sort of find your direction because moss grows on the north side of the tree. The reason it grows on the north side of the tree is that the conditions that it needs in order to be able to survive are better on the north side of the tree than the south side of the tree. If you think about where the sun is shining, the sun shines on the south side of things. Like if you have a driveway that faces to the south, it probably isn't going to have a lot of buildup of ice and snow on it because the sun's rays are going to be more direct on the south side of things than on the north side. Well, if the sun doesn't shine on the north side of a tree trunk, then it's going to be a little more moist. There's going to be more water because the sun isn't beating down on it and evaporating the water away. So oftentimes we see moss growing on the north side of a tree. Liverworts is another one. These are plants that don't have roots. Liverwort is short for herbs of the liver. I'm gonna have to kind of cruise through this one kind of quickly, guys, because I have a meeting here in just a few minutes. So we'll see if we can get through this section pretty quickly. Again, if you need to slow down to get the notes, just just hit the pause button. Hornworts are this plant here. They have a flattened body, and each cell only has 1 chloroplast. Okay, that's one specific thing about hornworts. Non-vascular plants that live in the environment, we're thinking about mosses and liverworts. They live in moist environments, and they are able to withstand long periods where there isn't a lot of precipitation. Okay, they grow in soil where a lot of other plants aren't able to grow, and mosses are oftentimes the first plants that grow in a new environment. Now, if you remember back, we learned several chapters ago, we learned about succession, or how different species will overtake a new environment or a new ecosystem, or maybe it was an existing ecosystem that maybe was experienced a forest fire or something of that nature. Okay, the pioneer species are the first organisms to live or to grow in that new or previously disturbed area. Like a disturbed area would be like maybe a flood that happened in an ecosystem, or a forest fire burns all the trees and stuff, but there's still soil. Okay, so that's secondary succession. Seedless vascular plants. Now we're talking about ferns. Okay, that's the largest group of seedless vascular plants is ferns. They have stems, leaves, and roots, but they also have their leaves are called something different. They're called fronds. Okay, fronds. Those are the leaves of ferns. They produce spores, and those spores are used for reproducing or helping the plant to reproduce. Some of those ferns can grow up to 25 meters tall. We don't have any, I guess I haven't seen any around Minnesota anywhere near that big. But ferns are one of the more abundant plants that we find in the fossil record. And there's evidence that a lot of the planet was warm a long, long, long time ago, 360 million years ago, because we find fossils of ferns or fern-like plants in areas that are now very cold, like Antarctica and things like that. Here's just a picture of some different varieties of ferns around the planet. The next one we're going to talk about is club mosses. These are like ground pines, spike mosses. They have needle-like leaves. Like you can see these pine trees here. They kind of have these needle-like leaves. Sometimes these are what we use to make wreaths, like around Christmas time. Horsetails, which we have around here in Minnesota, oftentimes they're, or I should say mostly they're found in sandy regions. They have stems that are sort of like put together almost like Tinker Toys. If you pull those apart, you'll see there's like little valves in the middle there. If you squeeze it, a little bit of juice will come out. I think I had heard before that Native Americans or before things like shampoo and stuff like that, that juice could be used for shampoo and getting rid of head lice and stuff like that. These organisms produce little tiny spores. They can also be used to polish material. If you ever feel the outside of these horsetails are kind of have these little ridges, almost like sandpaper. And if you rub that on your fingernail, you'll see that your fingernail will start to scrape off a little bit. There's lots of different uses for seedless vascular plants. They can be used as house plants, landscaping. Some of them can be eaten, some used in folk medicine. Some ferns can be used to treat things like skin ailments like bee stings, burns, fevers, and dandruff, stuff like that. Okay, I'm going to take a little break here because I got to go off to that meeting. When I come back, I'll continue on talking about seed plants in section 9.3. I'll be back after a bit. All right, 9.3, seed plants. These are probably some of the plants that we're the most familiar with. Seeds can be a lot of different things, everything from, maybe if you're hiking in the wood and you get those little cockleburs or those little stickers that stick to you, or like the little seeds that are on dandelion flowers. But we're pretty familiar with these. Some things that seed plants definitely have leaves. Those leaves have different layers within their cells, stems, roots, vascular tissue. So this should sound kind of familiar because it's sort of like the plants that we're relatively used to. So we talked a little bit earlier about how to subcategorize those, and so they are either in the group of gymnosperms, those are the ones that have cones, or angiosperms, and those are the flowering seed plants, okay? So if they have a flower and produce fruit, then they're considered an angiosperm. If they have cones, then gymnosperm. That would be vegetables, something that, oh, sorry about that. Okay, so the flowering ones producing fruits and vegetables and things like that. So the vascular tissues that they would have are their three, xylem, phloem, and cambium. We'll get to those, the details of each of those here. The xylem are these tube-like structures that help to move water and other substances. Now, if you think about how water travels up a tree, right? We think about some of these trees that are really tall, like redwood and sequoia trees. And it would be really hard, don't you think, to get water all the way to the top of those trees. Well, water molecules have a natural tendency to want to stick together. They're a polar molecule, which means that one side of the molecule is positively charged, their side is negatively charged. And when they are in contact, those opposites, if they're kind of like magnets, opposites attract, okay? So the water molecules like to stick together, and by doing that, it makes it so that as the water molecules get pulled up to the top of the trees, they are able to, the water molecules all stick together and it pulls it up almost like a string all together. So the difference then between xylem and phloem is that phloem is responsible for moving food, and you can see that there's these little separations here, okay? So things are able to get through, but they have to have little pathways to get through, whereas xylem is kind of just like an open tube. Cambium then is the tissues that produce new xylem and phloem cells. If you were to ever maybe cut a tree with a chainsaw, we have the outer part, that's the bark, and then just inside of the bark then is we have the cambium. Okay, this is that vascular tissue, and it's sometimes it's hard to see the difference between where the cambium ends and the woody part starts, but right inside, pardon, right inside of the bark there. And obviously we're pretty familiar with roots. The roots are responsible for keeping the tree anchored in place. It's there to help absorb water and nutrients, storage for food and water. The roots of some plants would be the energy storage. So like carrots and beets and things like that. Those roots are actually acting as an energy storage vessel. And we think about the sugars, and that's why some vegetables, we like to eat the roots. Now, the stems, there's two different types. They're herbaceous stems. They're like the greenish colored ones, like if you were to go out on the prairie and you pluck something, it has kind of a greenish herbaceous stem, or they're woody stems, okay? Woody stems are more rigid, meaning they're more hard. And we think oftentimes of things that have a woody stem are, more like trees. So like lumber. Lumber comes from trees that have woody stems, and because they're so much more rigid, we can use them for building structures and things of that nature. Okay, so here's just a little quick diagram, the difference between what we would consider to be a woody stem versus more of a green, almost a fleshy kind of a stem, or the herbaceous stem. We're pretty familiar with leaves. Leaves are the spot on the plant where the photosynthesis occurs. If you recall, photosynthesis is necessary in order to create sugar molecules, and then those sugar molecules get taken to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria then go through cellular respiration, right? So photosynthesis has to happen first. Energy from the sun interacts with the thylakoid membranes inside the chloroplast, if you guys remember that, and that's where the photosynthesis is occurring. And then it creates a sugar molecule, and then that sugar molecule gets taken to the mitochondria. Now that's different from human beings. When we consume food, that food gets turned into, or through the digestion process, that those molecules get broken down into sugar molecules. Now, whether you're eating meat or lipids, which are like fats and oils, or just straight sugar, or other carbohydrates, all of that stuff gets turned into sugar. And those sugar molecules, if they don't get used, they get stored as fat. In plants, if they don't get used, they get stored in the roots. Okay, so here's a cross section, or this is what a leaf would look like if we could cut it in half and then look at the different layers within the leaf. Again, several layers. The stoma, or the stomata, is this little opening here in the top, and it's surrounded by guard cells. And those guard cells are responsible for opening and closing the stoma. And this is really important because during times when it's warm, or if it's dark outside and it doesn't need to be releasing releasing oxygen, it doesn't need carbon dioxide to come in, then they'll close themselves, especially during hot and dry times, because the plant is going to try and, if it's hot or dry, it's going to try and conserve as much water as possible. Okay, gymnosperms then are the plants that create cones. And oftentimes we think of conifer plants, pine trees and other coniferous plants are probably the ones that we're most familiar with. And then the angiosperms, those are ones that produce flowers, and they have seed that's covered by fruit, okay? So we think about apple. The seeds are on the inside of the apple, and then there's fruit covering those seeds. And if we take an apple and we bury it, then this fruit, the sweet part that we would normally eat, is going to be able to provide the energy that's required for those seeds so that they can grow until they get big enough they can start doing photosynthesis. Other examples would be like a peach. Okay, the pit is the seed. The flowers of angiosperms, obviously, if we think about different types of fruit, tons of different sizes and shapes. It could be really, really, really small, like this is on someone's finger, or these fruits can be very, very large. Okay, they're a huge variety of shapes and colors. Now, angiosperms have life cycles, and there's 3 different types. Okay, there's annuals. Those are plants that life cycle is completed in just 1 year. There are biennials. Okay, bi means 2. Biennials, that means that they'll complete their entire life cycle in 2 years. And then if their life cycle lasts longer than 2 years, then we call them a perennial. And those are flowers that might come back year after year after year, but certainly more than 1 or 2 years. Okay. So angiosperms then are divided into 2 different groups. There's monocots and dicots, and we call them a monocot. Mono means 1. The prefix mono means 1. And cot stands for cotyledon. Now, the cotyledon, if you look at this picture down below here on the bottom right, the cotyledon is this little structure right here on these peanuts. So some organisms have only 1 cotyledon, or some of them have 2 cotyledons on the seed. Okay, so the prefix di means 2, like dice. If you're playing dice, oftentimes you're rolling 2 dice. Okay, now the difference between the 2 and how to identify the differences between the 2 is that monocots have flower parts that have multiples of 3, like 3 leaves, or I'm sorry, 3 petals on the flower, 6 petals on the flower, 9 petals, whatever it happens to be. Those structures tend to be in multiples of 3. And they also have veins that run the length of the flower. Dicots have flower parts that are in multiples of either 4 or 5. There are veins that are in the leaves, and they have woody stems. Okay, so I know that that's a lot to write down. If you need to pause the video for a minute so you can get caught up on that, go ahead and do so now. Okay, here's a picture now of the difference between the 2, 4 or 5 leaves, or petals rather, and we can see obviously there's 5 petals here. Over here, we only have 3 petals. The vascular tissues that we find in these plants, they can either come in bundles, or they can come in bundles are either in rings or they're scattered. So the one on the left here, these are scattered. Okay, so this is monocot, and if they're in bundles or rings, then it comes from a dicot or a dicotyledon. All right, things that we might find that we get from gymnosperms are things like lumber, paper soap, varnish, paints, waxes, perfumes, some pine nuts we're actually able to eat, and then some medications. And then from angiosperms, we get a lot of things like food, sugar, chocolate, cotton, linen, rubber, vegetable oils, perfumes, medicine, cinnamon, other types of flavorings, dye, and then we can also get lumber from some angiosperms as well. All right, guys, that is it. That's the end of the chapter. I hope you're progressing on the worksheets and everything. Let me know if you have any questions. You can share questions on the Google forum or the open document, and I'll answer those questions for you. You can certainly call or shoot me an email. All right. I hope you guys are all doing well, and you're being careful about who you're sharing air with. Have a good day.